I'm going to be talking about some qualitative work that we did in Banke relating to food safety, specifically trying to understand molds and aflatoxins within the area among farming families. So before I start the actual description of the study that we did, I just want to describe aflatoxins a little bit more. Aflatoxins are very dangerous. They are declared a declared carcinogen, and they have been linked to other health issues such as poor linear growth. And they're produced by multiple fungi from the Aspergillus genus. And a lot of the evidence that's been looking at health effects of different mycotoxins, specifically aflatoxins, that's the biggest one that's studied, are mostly in Africa. And it seems like there's a lack of research in the Asian context, especially in areas that are conducive to this mold that produces a toxin, such as in Banke, where it's very hot and it's very humid. So we feel like there's a little bit more research needed, both on the agricultural piece, so what are technologies and techniques that are being used that are protective for avoiding these molds, and then what are possible health effects that they're having. So the objectives of our qualitative study were to understand and characterize the knowledge and the practices of farming families in the area, specifically how they understand or define food safety, and if within this food safety definition, they would include molds as an issue, for example. And then we specifically, within these qualitative groups, wanted to also prompt for the idea of aflatoxin and if it's been heard of in this area. And we also wanted to find out a little bit more about if they've heard of aflatoxins, or if they do see molds on their crops and perceive that as a food safety issue, do they associate certain detrimental effects with these molds or toxins? And we wanted to use these findings for a birth cohort study that we have ongoing in Banke right now. And and that's just a picture of the Aspergillus flavus that is one of the molds that produces this toxin called aflatoxin. So in terms of our study, we had approval from both the NHRC and the Tufts IRB to do this study. We recruited both men and women in the area to get a diverse set of answers. We also didn't want to limit the age too much because farmers don't have an age limit, so we included anybody over 18. And then participants either had to be farmers or have some training in farming, and this was actually very easy to find in the area. We had a total of 7 focus groups, and 4 of them were with females and 4 of them were males. We had a total of 40 women and 34 men. And the 4 BDCs we chose to do these focus groups in were Coalpur, Bancatwa, Manikapur, and Sonpur. And these are actually 4 BDCs that we have in our birth cohort right now. But they're not the same participants. So in terms of data collection, each group lasted about an hour to an hour and a half, which is usual. There were about 10 to 12 participants in each group. And all focus groups were conducted by a trained facilitator and also a note taker. Most of them were Nepali or Awadhi, and then there was one that was, or a few of them that were a mixture between Nepali and Taru, or Nepali and Awadhi. And these are some pictures, I don't know if you can see them very well, but of one of the female focus groups and one of the male focus groups. For the analysis, we had audio taped all of the focus groups, and we transcribed them, and then they were translated into English for the analysis. We used en vivo, and we had 2 coders to look at the groups to make sure that the different codes that we came up with were similar or in agreement with each other. And we used inductive and deductive methods, mostly inductive, for the coding of these themes. So in terms of, for the results, I'm just gonna highlight a few of the quotes. And first give you a list of what were the major food safety themes that came up within these discussions. Pests and diseases and overuse of pesticides were huge. It seemed like that was the #1 topic that they were concerned with. Everyone seemed to experience issues with pests, and then there was a lot of concern about having, even though they had access to pesticides, they did apply them. They often thought that they were being over-applied, for example. And then molds did come up in most groups, and a couple of them we had to prompt for the molds question. But once it was prompted for, there was a lot of discussion around molds, and the majority of them had experienced issues with molds. And unpredictable weather was also an issue brought up. And lack of knowledge and lack of infrastructure were also two big issues. And for this presentation, I'm just going to show you quotes from those bolded themes. So in terms of pests and diseases, here you can see a female participant said, despite proper care, the crops get attacked by pests. Medicine should be used for that. So they know that certain pesticides should be used, but they're saying oftentimes, even if I use them, it's not successful. Another participant said, while he, the farmer, is working on one land, the other land gets affected by diseases and pests. The diseases are so intense that the whole field is destroyed. So this is referring to two things: a lack of time to deal with the amount of land or production that they have, and then the amount of damage that these pests can cause. In terms of molds, I'm going to show you a few more quotes because this is something we were interested in because this was also playing a role of formative work for our birth cohort. The participant said, for example, we don't know about the medicines for molds, so we don't do anything. We put water, but we don't know what to spray for molds. And it seems like there was a common consensus that fungicides aren't used as much, or they don't know as much about them as they do about pesticides. And there's just kind of a lack of prevention methods is what seemed to be repeated. But then there were some traditional methods identified, such as a participant said, we keep ashes in the vacari before storage in order to prevent molds, and we dry the crops too. So they are using like neem leaves, ashes, salt, which they identify as ways to prevent the molds and pests too. And then once they saw molds in their crops, these are a few quotes from that. They said, I had stored rice grains in a metal drum, and all of it was wasted because of molds. And the material of the different storage units was brought up a lot. So if they're made of wood or straw or metal, and there was disagreement on what is the best one. It seemed there was no consensus as to which one is the best. It depends on the crop, and it depends on what happened that year. But what this quote shows you is that when they see these damaged crops, oftentimes they have to throw all of them away. And the other quote was very, very insightful for us. It said, if molds are there, we use our methods for making them better for eating. We give remaining ones to livestock or produce alcohol. And if the foods are severely damaged, we throw them away. So for a quantitative study, we wanted to know, what are they doing with the moldy foods that they see? When they see the mold, what do they do with it? And we had the typical options of sorting, throwing it all away, eating it as is. Livestock we kind of expected. But this is very concerning that they confirmed that they are feeding it to livestock, for example, because aflatoxins can actually show up in the livestock product, like in the milk or in the meat. So we know that they're feeding it to livestock, and not necessarily are they being fed aflatoxins, we don't know that, but we know that they're doing that practice. And then alcohol was the most insightful because two of the women's groups brought up this issue. We had no idea, at least the researchers had no idea that that's what they would do with moldy foods. And aflatoxins are pretty stable, so even though you can deactivate them quite a bit, it's still, a lot of the aflatoxin will remain in the product and can come back into the food system through the alcohol. So we added that response option to our quantitative work. And then lastly, the last quote from molds is, the molds affect crops here in the Terai both during the summer and the winter. We store rice in tin drums, which in the summer causes condensation and doesn't let the crops dry properly. Dampening in rainy seasons also causes molds. So this is bringing up again the issue of the storage unit and what it's made out of. But it's also a misconception that it's the metal drum that's causing that mold. It's actually more likely that they just didn't dry it properly before it was placed in that metal drum. So kind of mixed interpretations here. And then we did ask directly, because we as the group wanted to know, have they heard of aflatoxins? Have they heard of the term aflatoxin? And do they have another term to call this toxin, perhaps? And there was consensus that no, nobody had heard of this toxin. And once we had the facilitator describe where the toxin is prevalent and where what it kind of looks like, and they were also shown images of the mold, a lot of them did have agreement that they had seen that type of mold on a lot of their crops. So for example, one woman said, it is seen in vessels where crops are stored. And another woman said maize is more affected by molds. Sometimes there's rainfall while harvesting maize, and we store them without drying. Molds appear. So they're aware that if you don't dry the products well, you see these molds. And they also did say, yes, if one person, for example, said, if you've never seen those molds, you're not a farmer. So even though they may not associate a toxin with it, they do see similar molds to the one that produces this toxin. So lastly, there were just two main factors that really affected food safety that were identified in these groups, lack of knowledge and then lack of input and infrastructures. So lack of knowledge, one person said, for example, we do farming and plant seeds according to old thinking. It depends on God's wish. We cannot understand science and technologies. And another person said, the pesticides harm us and the effects increase from generation to generation. The coming generations will become more unhealthy and weak, and the main reason for this is lack of knowledge and our unsafe behavior. So a lot of them mentioned lack of knowledge, but then there were others who actually mentioned, I have the knowledge, I just can't implement a lot of these things because I don't have the resources or the time. And then lastly, there's two quotes for lack of agricultural infrastructure and input. So one farmer said, we produce rice paddies in large quantities, and there's a lack of storage. So these, that I produces a lot of rice, and oftentimes they mentioned they couldn't dry it properly because there were such large amounts, or they couldn't store it properly to protect it. And then last quote is that once I bought corn seed for planting, the packet was nice from the outside, but when I opened it, there was green mold inside. Still, I planted the same seeds. So oftentimes lack of resources doesn't allow them to implement the right practice, which in this case would have probably been throw away those seeds, go buy some new ones. So these damaged products are something that they're still having to plant. So lessons learned from these focus groups are really helpful for us to understand the context and understand what are some good practices that are already being implemented and what are some misconceptions among these groups. And participants were able to identify and employ a mixture of effective and ineffective strategies. It seems that pest and high moisture are a huge issue for them. And this, for us, was concerning because both those things can increase the risk of having aflatoxin. And then consideration should be given to more low-cost storage technologies or techniques. They have a lot of options, but trying to find out what are the most low-cost and most effective at making sure that crop is kept safe. And then closer examination of access and availability to quality inputs is also important to make sure that these products are of good quality from the beginning to the end, to the consumption stage. And lastly, they identified rice, potatoes, maize, wheat, peanuts, and chilies as the crops that are most susceptible to molds. And importantly, as I mentioned before, none of them had heard of aflatoxins. All this qualitative data was really helpful for us to then refine our questionnaire for the quantitative study. So I just want to acknowledge my co-authors and my committee members and our partners, Spatan Academy of Health Sciences and Helen Keller and the Child Health Division, and all the participants and all our field team who made this possible, and USAID for funding this research. Thank you.